think the American one-third of the Senate, regardless of whether they're going to vote Democrat congressman, said, well, Mr. to nations which in turn shipped the sinews of economic and military strength to Red China, which is running the war in Indochina, keeping in mind that if we lose Indochina, Mr. Jenkins, we will lose the Pacific and we'll be an island in a communist sea.
The situation in the area as we found it was that it was subject to the so-called domino theory. And that meant that if one nation went, then another nation would go and so on. We're trying to change that so it won't be the case. That's the whole theory of collective security.
Agreement between the Commander-in-Chief of the French Union forces in Indochina and the Commander-in-Chief of the People's Army of Vietnam on the cessation of hostilities in Vietnam, signed at Geneva, July 20, 1954. Article 14. Pending the general elections which will bring about the unification of Vietnam, the conduct of civil administration in each regrouping zone shall be in the hands of the party whose forces are to be regrouped there in virtue of the present agreement. Article 16. With effect from the date of entry into force of the present agreement, the introduction into Vietnam of any troop reinforcements and additional military personnel is prohibited. Article 18. With effect from the date of entry into force of the present agreement, the establishment of new military bases is prohibited throughout Vietnam territory.
We support the objectives that are involved in this thing because it was done in the Eisenhower administration in 1954. We were not signers of the so-called Class B treaty or convention at Geneva, Switzerland, but we did make a formal and solemn pledge that we were going to safeguard the independence and the freedom of Vietnam. Now, we can renege if we like, but what will happen to our credibility in the world if we take that course?
Every day, someone jumps up and shouts and says, tell us what is happening in Vietnam and why are we in Vietnam and how did you get us into Vietnam? Well, I didn't get you into Vietnam. You've been in Vietnam 10 years.
Saigon was in a state of civil war. The rebel Binh Xuyen movement tried to incite the people to overthrow the government. In 36 hours non-stop fighting, 500 were killed, more than 1,000 wounded. Vietnam Premier Diem was still in office when we received these pictures. Unfortunately, the West does not agree about Saigon. General Ely, on-the-spot commander for France, is instructed to oppose Diem. Malcolm MacDonald has flown there reportedly to do the same, whereas America stands behind Premier Diem. Meanwhile, Saigon suffers the agonies of civil war. In Cannes is the absentee Emperor Bao Dai. First reported deposed, Bao Dai may stage a comeback. As it is, Vietnam seems ripe for communist invasion.
Diem, I said before, was the man of the hour. Why? Once colonialism came to an end through the victory of the Viet Minh against the French at Dien Bein Phu and through the agreement in Geneva, this trend in Vietnamese history, which favored the communists exclusively, could be broken, since colonialism, the creator of communism, so to speak, was now dead. There was a chance that other forces might be able to compete with Ho Chi Minh. However, under certain conditions, they had to be as nationalistic as Ho Chi Minh. They had to be free of the taint of collaboration with the French. They had to be the opposite of puppets of colonialism. Now, Diem was precisely that man.
A lot of it was rather skillfully done in public relations, I think. There's no doubt about that. There was sort of a cult of the little fellow in the sharkskin suit and the little Mandarin who's going to stop the Reds. And there was a great many articles along this line, you know, sort of Ngo Dinh Diem, our man in Saigon.
You have exemplified in your corner of the world patriotism of the highest order. You have brought to your great task of organizing your country the greatest of courage, the greatest of statesmanship, qualities that have aroused our admiration and make us indeed glad to welcome you. I thank you very much.
Part of my involvement with Vietnam was to be active in founding the so-called American Friends of Vietnam, a private organization dedicated to the promotion of understanding, spread of information, and support of Diem. I was, in fact, more or less running the organization as chairman of the executive committee.
The American Friends of Vietnam was a lobby group set up, I think, about 1955, really to a lobby for the Ngo Dinh Diem regime in this country. And I think the particularly interesting thing about it was that it was so much of it, and so many of its more distinguished names were liberal names. People like Max Lerner and Arthur Schlesinger, Senator John F. Kennedy, people like that. And this gave, of course, the Diem government a very good liberal umbrella. I mean, the sensitivities and the sensibilities of many liberal people who might otherwise have been dubious about that regime were eased off. The Diem regime got, right from the start, I think, the benefit of the doubt.
It is on the same plan that the interests of the Vietnam are identical with the interest of the people of a free world. It is on this plan that your and our fight is one and the same. We too will continue to fight communism.
It is not, it may be really repeated here, there is no two Vietnams, there is only one Vietnam, temporarily divided in Geneva in '54 between a free zone with the North Vietnam and an occupied zone, occupied by the French, and the French had still, after Geneva, the jurisdiction over South Vietnam because they could not hand it over to a regime which did not exist. It's not even mentioned in the Geneva Agreement. The regime of Saigon is only a temporary one, in waiting for election.
The refusal was amply justified, if only because the kind of election envisaged by the Geneva Agreement of 1954, a free election, could not have been held. Anyone who thinks that a free election was possible in communist North Vietnam knows little of how communists operate and could have fallen into a Moscow peeping trap. The United States could not agree today any more than in 1956 to legitimizing communist control of all Vietnam by a device of a communist-style election.
And you ought to have sat with me on the Foreign Relations Committee in 1956 when our intelligence forces brought in their reports warning that if the election called for by the Geneva Accords for July 1956 were held, Ho Chi Minh would be elected president in South Vietnam by at least 80% of the vote. And our country that boasts about believing in self-determination used its power and its prestige and its influence really to get our first puppet government under Diem not to cooperate in holding those elections. That's just a matter of historic record.
As you know, Ngo Dinh Diem and Nhu were finally killed in 1963. Some 50 to 60,000, and the precise number is not readily available, but some 50 to 60,000 political prisoners were released from prisons in South Vietnam subsequent to this. Elements of the rotating governments that followed the death of Diem and Nhu have indicated that most of those people were not Viet Cong sympathizers in any way, shape, or form. which would indicate that all political activity that was antithetical to Diem and Nhu was met either with murder in the South or imprisonment.
And from 1958, we see the existence, confirmed by some American experts and some broadcasts from Hanoi, of a national front for liberation of South Vietnam. It was, in fact, a confederation of all the forces who, for years, were struggling against the Diem regime, and it was not, as it has been said too much and too often, the political arm of Hanoi. The National Front for Liberation included the former remnants of the political religious sects, Cao Dan Hao, the Binh Xuyen Tu, the former Viet Minh, the Democratic Party, the Radical Socialist Party, and various other elements who are united in the common aim to overthrow the regime, to create a coalition government, a democratic regime in the South, in order to be able to discuss with the North the provision of Geneva. That means the end of the occupation regime in the South and peaceful reunification between the two parts of Vietnam.
The front is not what you would call a puppet of Hanoi. The two organizations, and I do stress that they are two organizations, work very closely together. Many of their aims are parallel aims, but their ideas do not always coincide, and indeed sometimes their policies are in conflict.
Land reform was a total failure. There were sporadic attempts to try and deal with land, but they never had any real support from Diem.
What he did was that he gave to the 1,200,000 tenants some land. Actually, he didn't give it to them. He sanctioned the fact that the Viet Minh had given it to them, but he made them pay for it now. The downhill trend of the Diem regime is best described by the increase of corruption, by the increase of the influence of a near-psychopath like his brother Nhu and his wife, Madame Nhu, both of whom had a drive for power which I can only describe as pathological. I had once dinner with them, and Nhu told me, you see, we could have an opposition in Vietnam if I led it. But since I'm the only intelligent man in South Vietnam, all my mental capacity goes into leading my brother to rule South Vietnam. I have nothing left to organize an opposition. Now, this kind of conceit is, of course, pathological. However, this man gained more and more influence over Diem, together with his wife.
This is the kind of psychology you had in a turbulent, changing Asia. I mean, this old sort of Mandarin idea, you know, that I am right, I have almost this divine right to rule. How can you challenge what I say? Because I am incorruptible.
Staley bought the strategic Hamlet from Nhu. Nhu brought it out as a new little goodie, and no pun intended, but came up with a strategic Hamlet. And this amounted to the same old approach of forced relocation, the living behind bars, the total regimentation of the social and the fabric of the society. One of the more significant things about the strategic Hamlet is that they were physically and literally demolished by the Viet Cong after Diem and Nhu were killed. Every stick was taken down, every piece of wire, and the enemy took this off to make use of it and told the people, return to your ancestral homes. And at that time, they began to take control, effective control over the countryside.
Diem was corrupted on vanity and power, Nhu on his own ego, Madame Nhu certainly on power. She was the one who really understood what they were doing the most. She was the most realistic one. She had no illusions about them. She was a smart, strong, dynamic woman. No illusions about herself. And she tended to set policy. She knew what they wanted. She didn't worry about what the Americans were saying, you know, be nice, do this nice popular thing. The important thing to her was the survival of the family. And anybody who got in the way of the survival of the family was a threat.
In this affair, I do not think that we should worry too much, because we have the same fate. Whatever happens in my country, We shall not feel it alone. You also, you will feel it.
The base of Diem was his army, which was American supported, and American aid coming through, and there's the police force, and generally an increasingly police state technique. But there was no dissent. They controlled the legislature, which was a rubber stamp, and...
About the question of a rubber stamp parliament, I have repeatedly said, but what wrong to rubber stamp the laws we approve?
A major policy paper issued by the State Department in December of 1961 stated flatly, and I quote, the years 1956 to 1960 produced something close to an economic miracle in South Vietnam. It is a report of progress over a few brief years equaled by few young countries, end quote.
It has been said by Confucius wonderfully well. He said, never have laws too precise, because the precision of the law gives the possibility to get around it. Have laws that are built by governments which are reliable, which know you, which are close to you. And this is how, in the organization of the Vietnamese society, the village was so essential. And I think that this has been the great mistake of Ngo Dinh Diem, to replace the leader of the village, who was the expression of the country, the expression, as they say, of the wind and the water of the locality. He replaced that by appointed village chiefs. Now, when the Viet Cong assassinated village chiefs, they were not at all village chiefs, but people who were not belonging there. And it was a scandal to a village that were then there. And so when the Viet Cong assassinated so many of those people, and I am not a man who likes to hear that people have been assassinated, and some of them might have been very good people, the majority might have been acceptable if they had been the expression of the village, but at the very point where the Vietnamese nation, the Vietnamese earth, arises and speaks to the government through the, not chiefs, through the representatives of the village, the elders of the village, at that very point where the life of the country is, Ngo Dinh Diem put simply a wet blanket of functionaries, just at the point where was the life of the country. He brought the extinguishing methods of a government which was not a government for the Vietnamese.
One of the very significant events toward the end of the Diem regime, which indicated the degree of decay, particularly in the morale of the army, was the Battle of Ap Bac. It indicated that militarily the Diem regime was unable to handle the insurrection, and it brought about the discussions in Washington, which eventually led to the decision to put in our own troops and not only our equipment.
I think the Vice President's journey represented a great public service. There are members from both parties here today to greet him. There were members of both parties in his group going around the world. This was an American effort to indicate our great concern for the cause of freedom in insignificant and important countries around the world.
We visited in several countries where the population would add up to more than 750 million people. We didn't see all of those people, but we saw a good many of them, as well as their leaders. We never heard a hostile voice, and we never shook a hostile hand.
When Vice President Johnson, which was also part of the '61 arrangement, when he came to Vietnam, he announced a series of things that the United States was going to do. And this is when we made a fundamental change in our policy.
I can remember Bernard Fall in 1962 interviewing Pham Van Dong, the Prime Minister, of North Vietnam and talking about the American aid. And Pham Van Dong was sort of saying, oh, poor Diem, poor Diem. He is unpopular. And because he is unpopular, the Americans must give him aid. And because the Americans give him aid, he becomes less popular. And because he becomes less popular, the Americans must give him more aid. And because they give him more aid, he becomes even less popular. And Bernard Faure interrupted and said, that sounds like a vicious circle. Pham Van Dong paused and said, no, not a vicious circle, a downward spiral.
I'm Roger Hilsman. I was Director of Intelligence and Research in the State Department under John F. Kennedy, and then Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs under Kennedy and for a while under President Johnson. Dramatic was one day in Saigon when a Buddhist parade started off with a sort of a hypnotic chant, the yellow-robed priests marching along, and then there stepped forward a frail old man in his 70s who turned out to be this priest.
Well, I don't think anything really gives the flavor or the fever of that time, other than to point out that when this monk burned himself, Ngo Dinh Diem really believed that American television networks had staged this. They had paid the Buddhists to stage this burning for their own benefit. I mean, after all, the Americans were Diem's allies.
And then suddenly a towering flame. And what was, the priests and the nuns in the audience moaned and prostrated themselves towards this burning figure, and he sat there unflinching, and the smell of gasoline and of burning flesh in the air for 10 minutes. The political effects of this were enormous. It was so dramatic. It hit the headlines all over the world. It had enormous political consequences outside of Vietnam and inside of Vietnam. People thought they saw the face of Buddha in the clouds that night.
People have spoken very much about the monks who burned themselves. But those monks who burned themselves because they were incited to do it.
The American idea, which was that sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem, as my colleague Homer Biggert had coined the phrase, I think the idea of that was, well, that he had become an expendable man. The American policy had always been that he was the only man we had. Johnson had called him the Winston Churchill of Southeast Asia, which a unique tribute to Mr. Churchill. And so I think that with this, they had changed the American policy view of them, that they were expendable. And what happened was, of course, the coup did take place on that day in November, and they were murdered. And it had taken place in an atmosphere where the Americans, who had, in a sense, created this regime, who had given it what little sustenance it had, whose invention Ngo Dinh Diem had really always been, had withdrawn, because after all, the VC were about to take the cities without even a fight. I mean, the VC were running rampant over the countryside. The strategic Hamlet program was really finished. It didn't exist. And it was not so much that the Americans had aided the coup or created it, but as they had given all their aid to Diem, they had moved back, and they had said, no, we just support the anti-communist effort. It wasn't that they were on the side of the others, but they made it very clear that they would stand aside. And with that, they'd spelled the final end of that regime.
gone in on the assumption, this is the myth, that a friendly government has asked us to come in and prevent a takeover. Well, what friendly government? That government has changed half a dozen times since that time. It changes from week to week. No one knows just what the government is.
I am very much impressed by the military and economic and the social programs instituted by General Khan. I appreciated also the opportunity to talk with the Chief of State, General Mann.
In other words, you cannot defeat the communists without the support of the people. And to have this support, you must bring justice to the people. In other words, equality and freedom.
How do you achieve this now?
Justice, justice. Banish corruption. Give to the people a higher standard of living and make them feel free.
Would Kennedy have done what Johnson has done? There were two things that he very, very much wished to avoid. One was making this an American war. As he used to say, it's their war, the South Vietnamese. We can give them aid, we can advisors. But they must win it or lose it. And I think he was fully prepared to let them lose it rather than make it an American war. He felt that if we put Americans in there, it would drive, with their white faces, it would drive communism into the, nationalism into the arms of communism. The second thing he wished to avoid was internationalizing the war, as we called it. By this we meant bombing the North or attacking the North. First and foremost, because it would not work. And here, 30-some-odd months of bombing has shown that his judgment was right.
I think that there's great danger in this country because of the fact that so much of our economy is geared in the military area. There is grave danger of a military industrial alliance of a kind actually affecting policy. Now, Vietnam is the case in point, not the only place, because we're spending $50 billion a year outside of Vietnam for military. And I do think that having dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were dropped by all the Allied powers in World War II in tonnage on that small country, I mean, to me, it's just how silly can you get?
I think communist aggression must result in communist disaster. And I don't think you're going to get that at the conference table. And the world is watching us in Vietnam to see if we'll put our money where our mouth is. It's just that simple.
And I just wish that we would decide to win the war and that we would step out and close the port of Haiphong and hit every military remunerative target over there. And I think you're a better chance to bring the communists to the conference table than if we do not hurt them.
However, American instinct makes us want to jump in with both feet and get an unpleasant job over with as soon as possible. But traditional Oriental patience makes them willing to carry on the struggle into generation after generation if necessary. We're fighting a war over there with the commodity most precious to us and held far more cheaply by the enemy, the lives of men.
I don't think it's necessary to have an invasion of North Vietnam. And it would be just exactly what the enemy wants. He'd like us to put down 100,000 men in the field, and they put down 100,000. They're willing to lose half of theirs, and ours is a precious commodity. And I wouldn't trade one dead American for 50 dead Chinamen.
We must fight the war from our strength, not the enemy's. We must fight it at least cost to ourselves and at greatest cost to the enemy. We must change the currency of this game from men to materiel.
What's that? What is the greatest single problem we're facing in Vietnam?
Well, it's the despicable communist enemy. There's no question about it. And the sooner we smash him, as we should have done in Korea. If we'd done it in Korea in our first test of arms with communism, we wouldn't be confronted, I don't think, with the situation we have in Vietnam.
Do you have respect for the Viet Cong? Do you think they're a good soldier?
Well, there's no question about it. They're willing to die readily, as all Orientals are. And their leaders will sacrifice them, and we won't sacrifice ours.
The only solution I see is to use our strength, our air and naval power in the most humane possible manner possible to destroy North Vietnamese capability to wage war against the free people of South Vietnam.
So I think the sooner that we hit everything we can and hurt them over there, we got a better chance to win that war, and that's exactly what we should do, in my opinion.
So the harbor at Haiphong and the entire capacity to receive outside help, close it. The power system that fuels every war-making facility. The transportation system, rails, rolling stock, bridges, yards, eliminate them. Every factory and every industrial installation, beginning with the biggest and the best, and never ending so long as our two bricks still stuck together. And if necessary, the irrigation system on which food production largely depends. We must be willing to continue our bombing until we've destroyed every work of man in North Vietnam if this is what it takes to win the war.
Then there was a little crisis there. The military thought that there was a great infiltration. And Secretary McNamara went out and came back and said, no, there wasn't a crisis at that time. But I thought it was very significant that President Johnson then appointed a committee to prepare a list of targets in the North in case he should decide to bomb the North. The more I thought about this, the more I became convinced that if there were a crisis, he would escalate the war.
This is part of the steady escalation that's taken place during the last 5 years. First, we sent in only advisors. Then it developed these advisors were also in combat. Then we sent in the Marines, and the first thing was said that they were there only to defend. Then the next thing was that they would shoot back if attacked. And now there is an admission that we're all in.
Some others are eager to enlarge the conflict. They call upon us to supply American boys to do the job that Asian boys should do. They ask us to take reckless action, which might risk the lives of millions and engulf much of Asia, and certainly threaten the peace of the entire world.
A second deliberate attack was made during darkness by an undetermined number of North Vietnamese PT boats on the USS Maddox and the USS C. Turner Joy, while the two destroyers were cruising in company on routine patrol duty in the Tonkin Gulf in international waters some 65 miles from the nearest point of land.
They put out that propaganda, but they got caught because we were able to disclose within 2 days that if they would check upon the log of the Maddox, for example, they would find she was only 11 to 13 miles from the bombing of those islands. And of course, that's coverage. And the North Vietnamese knew that it was coverage.
Do our naval vessels afford any cover for these?
Our naval vessels afford no cover whatsoever.
Now, the sad fact is, history will record that the United States was an aggressor in Tonkin Bay. We were violating the rights of North Vietnam, had no right to proceed on the second day to ourselves bomb North Vietnam, the areas where her torpedo boats were kept. But we had to do it. That wasn't self-defense. Bombing North Vietnam was not within the right of the president to act in self-defense of the Republic.
My duties on board the seaplane tender were nuclear weapons officer. On August 4th, there was an alleged attack upon the USS Maddox and Turner Joy, two of our destroyers, in the Gulf of Tonkin. The destroyer personnel indicated at first that they were under attack and later indicated uncertainty as to whether or not they were under attack. Large numbers of torpedoes were supposed to have been fired. The ship was reporting itself as continuously maneuvering to avoid torpedo attack. And yet there was also indicated in these messages doubt as to whether or not they were under attack at all.
And I have a feeling, therefore, that this harassment attack and this attack with 20 or more torpedoes upon two of our destroyers was designed to force us out of the way lest we precipitate a greater struggle. I have a feeling that they've misread America once again.
In the course of our conversation, this chief petty officer told me that he was a sonar man on board the USS Maddox and that he had been in the sonar room during the attack. He told me that in his estimation, there were no torpedoes fired at the ship or otherwise during that alleged attack. And furthermore, he constantly repeated this, sent this information to the commanding officer on the bridge.
The North Vietnamese have no submarines. What is the purpose of that movement?
This is purely precautionary, so that the fleet will be prepared for all eventualities.
What sort of eventualities, General?
Well, possible submarine attack.
By whom?
By anyone.
Well, you always contended that in the first incident they were having...
I'm contending that having the Maddox and the Joy there constituted, in view of the knowledge as to what South Vietnamese boats were up to, an act of constructive aggression on our part.
The Vietnamese situation, as I noted on my visit back home last week and this week, has taken on some real spirit and real interest. And I thought perhaps a statement by the joint Senate-House Republican leadership would be timely and quite in order at this moment.
As a result of what we have done in South Vietnam, not only has the psychology changed there, but also it has had a most beneficial effect, in my opinion, among other free Asian countries who looked at South Vietnam as a test.
Okay, today's the day. It's the big one. This is the one we've been waiting for. This is the one you've all been saying to yourself, what this company needs is a good fight. By the grace of God, we're going to get it. From there, we're going to S&D, search and destroy, the thing you guys like. Okay. Some of you, I know this is going to be a shock to you, but it's a switch for old Alpha Troop. We're riding in. And we're not riding in on one of those dusty old APCs. We're going in first class. TWA, Teeny Weeny Airlines.